Dijon, 1452. Nobody in this market will touch one particular man. It's market day, and a man is walking the rows with a canvas bag. He stops at a stall of eggs. The seller counts out 4 and drops them in. A small loaf goes in the same way. Garlic, onions. Nobody hands him anything. Nobody's fingers go anywhere near his fingers. They tip the goods in from above, step back, and serve the next customer as though the last 30 seconds hadn't happened. Yet he isn't begging and he isn't stealing. Every item in that bag is written into a town ordinance. The same ordinance says he may kill any pig he finds loose inside the walls, keep the head and the neck for himself, and hand the rest of the animal back to whoever owned it. The man is the town's executioner, and that bag was worth more to him than the scaffold was. But that market is the end of an arrangement, not the start of one. To understand why a town would sit down and write a law about the correct way to hand a man an egg, you have to go back to the point where killing people stopped being a duty somebody took a turn at and became a job somebody held. This is what that job actually looked like from the inside. The ledger, not the legend. So let's take the post from scratch. The appointment, the tools, the men, the house on the wrong edge of town. And let's follow every coin, every carcass, and every egg in and out of it. Because on the page where the money actually came from, the scaffold barely appears. Here's the first problem with owning this business. You can't buy it. There is no counter you walk up to, no license you purchase, no premises you lease, no guild you pay into. In most of medieval Europe, the executioner's post was an appointment or a grant, handed down by a town council or a lord, and increasingly handed down inside one family. In France, the succession got so formalized that a boy named Louis de Morest was appointed executioner of Laon at the age of 10, with a regent doing the actual work until he turned 20. A 10-year-old held the office. A grown man did the killing on his behalf for the next decade. This job is older than most people assume too. Professional executioners appear in northern and central Europe from the early 13th century. A man called Nicolas Juan, nicknamed La Justice, held the office in the Vicomte of Caux by 1202. Paris had an official executioner by 1275. So your startup cost is nothing, which sounds like the best deal in this entire series until you look at what it actually means. The town supplies the kit. In the Châtillonnais, there are records of white gloves being given to the executioner in 1331, and again in 1438, and again in 1499. In Bordeaux, the city bought the man's bed. There's an entry from the 28th of January 1416 where the city pays 4 livres for it, then covers it with blankets and sheets. Riga's executioner worked with a sword made in Solingen by a smith called Johannes Hoppe, and that sword stayed with the office through every man who held it, right up until the post was abolished in 1863. Those gloves aren't yours, the bed isn't yours, the sword outlives you. At this point, you have spent nothing and you own nothing. The entry cost of this business was never money. You still pay it. So do your children. Every other trade in this series charges you at the front. This one charges you for 3 generations. Begin with what you're locked out of. Guild statutes across late medieval Europe refused entry to men considered defiling, and the executioner sat near the top of that category. No guild, in practice often no citizenship, and no route sideways into any of the ordinary trades that a man with capital would normally diversify into. Then the physical separation. Executioners were commonly required to live at the edge of town or outside it, on isolated plots, sometimes next to the things nobody else wanted to live next to. In church, they could be given a separate pew. Their families could be given separate ground to be buried in. Contact with them, with their possessions, with anything they had handled, was treated as something that transferred. By 1528, the town of Memmingen had a rule on the books that made it an offense to sit down and eat with the executioner. That one's later than our Dijon market, and it comes to us through secondary accounts, so hold it loosely. But the direction of travel is consistent everywhere the records survive. And then the part that actually shows up on a balance sheet. Executioner families married executioner families, not by preference, because the households that would have them were the other households already carrying the same mark. Your son marries into the trade, your daughter marries into the trade, your grandchildren inherit a surname that closes doors in towns they have never visited. That does something specific to capital. A miller's son can take the mill money and become a wool merchant. A tanner's son can buy land and stop smelling of dog dung within 1 generation. Your money can't leave the office because your family can't leave the office. You are running a business whose profits are trapped inside it forever. That's the entry cost, paid in full, upfront, by people not yet born. And you'd need every one of them. Because the thing nobody pictures about this job is that you couldn't do it alone. The picture in your head is one hooded man with an axe. Throw it away. In Riga, the executioner was a salaried municipal official who could employ an assistant and, for the waste work, up to 50 servants. 50. That is not a man with a weapon. That is a contractor with a payroll. France's crew came out of the family. Aides were younger brothers, cousins, nephews. The stigma that shut every other household to you also meant the only labor pool you could reliably recruit from was your own bloodline, which is another way of saying your wage bill and your dynasty were the same document. Training worked the same way. There was no school, no examination, no standard apprenticeship anywhere in medieval Europe that the records support. What there was a father. The Nuremberg executioner Franz Schmidt was trained from childhood by his own father, helping at executions as a boy and practicing his stroke on animals before he ever used it on a person. Schmidt is from the 16th century, and his account is one of the very few we have in the man's own words, so he's a window rather than a template. But that method, learn it from your father or don't learn it, is the one the evidence keeps pointing at. Why does the training matter so much for the money? Failure in this trade is not a bad review. In 1540, Thomas Cromwell was beheaded on Tower Hill, and the chronicler Edward Hall recorded that the axe was handled by a man he described as a ragged and butcherly miser, who very ungoodly performed the office. That sentence has outlived everyone involved by nearly 500 years. A botched job in front of a packed crowd got you contempt at best, and at worst, it got you a riot with you at the center of it. You therefore keep a skilled crew, on standby, indefinitely, for a job that almost never happens. Here's the number that should worry you, and it's the number the myth of this profession is built on ignoring. Executions were rare. We don't have clean medieval counts. The figures that survive are mostly later, and I'll keep flagging that, because most of what circulates online about executioner pay quietly borrows numbers from 2 or 3 centuries after the period it's describing. But those later French figures suggest that even a busy executioner in a major jurisdiction handled a few dozen executions in a year. In small Breton towns, the courts might not produce 4 executions in a decade. Put the fee schedule next to that. The detailed tariffs we have are early modern rather than medieval, and they vary wildly by town, which is itself the point. Bordeaux set 30 livres for a beheading, 20 for a burning, 6 for cutting off a hand. Paris could charge 100 livres for a beheading. Do the arithmetic on the good version of that. Say you're in a real city with real judicial traffic, and you get a dozen serious sentences in a year at the upper end of a local tariff. That's a decent sum arriving in irregular lumps at unpredictable intervals, and out of it you're feeding a household, a permanent assistant, and whatever crew you keep for the rest of the work. Run the bad version. 4 executions in 10 years, and a fee schedule that might as well be written on the moon. The town therefore has a problem, and it isn't a moral one. It needs a trained man permanently available for something that happens almost never. And it needs him to still be there, still competent, still living locally on the morning it finally does. It has to pay him for the waiting. Coin alone did not solve the problem. The office had a proper title, and almost everyone alive today only ever learns the first half of it. In France, he was the maître des hautes et basses œuvres, the master of high works and low works. High works is the part you know, capital sentences, and the spectacular non-capital ones, whipping, branding, mutilation, the pillory. Low works is everything else the town needed doing at its own edges, and it is where the money was. Start with the obvious income, because it isn't nothing. In Riga, the executioner drew a fixed municipal salary plus fees on top for corporal punishments, and a bill listing those fees survives from the late 16th century. That structure alone already beats the myth, because corporal punishment happened far more often than capital punishment did. A man who is paid per hanging starves. A man who is paid per whipping, per branding, per hour in the pillory, plus a salary that arrives whether the court is busy or not, eats. That is the boring half of the page. I told you the scaffold barely appears on it. Here's the page. The market levy. In many French towns, the executioner held a right called havage, and it entitled him to take fixed quantities of goods from sellers in the marketplace. Not to buy them, to take them. The Dijon Ordinance of 1452, the one from our cold open, sets it out in the flat administrative language of a man itemizing a stationery order. 1 small loaf or cake from certain foreign bakers, worth around a denier. 4 eggs from a large basket. 1 or 2 eggs from smaller quantities. Bunches of garlic, handfuls of onions, portions of pots, pears, apples, kindling, turnips, prunes, herring. It's a comically small list, and that's what makes it work. 4 eggs is nothing. 4 eggs from 60 qualifying baskets is 20 dozen eggs before noon, and you didn't pay for a single one. Now collect that from every foreign seller in the rows, every market day, every week of the year, for a 30-year career in a city with a large market, and then hand the whole arrangement to your son. Paul Friedland, whose work on this is the reason we can talk about it at all, describes havage as the principal source of income for many French executioners, and puts its range from a comfortable living all the way up to a very large one. The rite is old too. In Chartres, there's evidence for it as early as 1302. Low works proper. In many towns, the executioner had exclusive or near-exclusive rights over the sewers and the latrines. Every cesspit in the city, and by custom, whatever turned up in them. This was filthy, despised, and lucrative, which describes the entire business model. Riga's 50 servants weren't standing around the gallows. They were the waste operation. Carcasses. Animals that died in the streets were his, and so were their skins, which he sold. Stray and prohibited livestock were his to kill. That's where the Dijon pig rule comes from. He takes the head and the neck, the owner gets the rest back, and the owner learns not to let the pig out again. In Arras, the executioner eventually held the privilege of removing every dead horse in the city for his own profit, though that particular grant comes to us from the 18th century. Fines, stray dogs, livestock offenses, public urination, blasphemy, unlicensed begging, illicit gambling, where in Dijon he could seize the money on the table. In Strasbourg and Arras, executioners reportedly held the right to run gaming houses outright until it was taken back from them in the early 16th century. Tribute. This is the ugliest stream, and it was real. In 16th century Troyes, the executioner could collect a one-off 5 sous from prostitutes and a liard from lepers several times a year. In Dijon, an unauthorized foreign leper could have his pouch, his little cask, and his alms seized, plus a fine of 12 deniers tournois. In the same set of Dijon rules, a market loaf was worth about a denier, so one leper, correctly processed, was worth roughly a dozen loaves. Folk medicine. You will hear that executioners ran roaring medical practices selling blood, fat, and rope from the scaffold, and that it made them rich. The association is genuinely documented. Contemporaries did attribute strange properties to his touch and to objects that had been near an execution. But the number people quote at you, the percentage of his income that supposedly came from it, is not documented, and I couldn't find a primary account that carries it. In Riga, a museum holds 2 severed hands attributed to punished counterfeiters, and even there, what they were for is uncertain. So real and smaller than the internet wants it to be. Added up, salary, punishment fees, a legally enforceable claim on a slice of every market day, the sewer contract, the carcass trade, a share of the fines, tribute from the people with the least ability to refuse. Executions are one line on that page. They are not even the longest line. But look at those streams again, because they all share something, and it isn't a skill or a customer or a tool. Every single one of them exists because of a sentence in a town ordinance, and a sentence in a town ordinance can be rewritten in an afternoon. So what was actually being sold here? Because it wasn't labor and it wasn't a product. The town had a job that had to exist and that nobody would take, and it could not simply pay a large wage for it, because a large wage for a rarely used service is indefensible in front of a council that has to approve it. So instead of paying him in money, it paid him in rights over the things nobody else would go near. Corpses, carcasses, cesspits, lepers, prostitutes, gamblers, outsiders passing through the market. The whole edge of the town handed over as a franchise. That's the machine, not a monopoly in the way we'd use the word, but a bundle of exclusive claims bolted onto a post. And nobody outside the post could touch any of it. A neighbor couldn't decide to start clearing carcasses for money. A cousin couldn't set up collecting eggs from the bakers. The rights weren't attached to him, they were attached to the office, and the office had one holder. And that takes us back to the eggs, and to the strangest line in the whole Dijon ordinance. Those rules didn't just say what he could take, they regulated how he took it. The seller was to measure the quantity out and put it in themselves. He was not supposed to touch the goods directly. Later accounts describe a tin or a wooden spoon being used to keep his hand off the food entirely. Then there's the exception, and once you see the exception, you can't unsee the whole system. If a seller repeatedly refused, he was permitted to take it himself, with his hands. That exception is the enforcement mechanism. He isn't collecting this levy with violence, and he doesn't need a bailiff. His enforcement mechanism is his own contamination. Refuse him for long enough, and the man everyone in this market is careful not to brush against reaches into your basket. Whatever he touches, you are not selling today. What made him untouchable was doing work. It was the collection department. Now the ceiling on all this, because the rights ran both ways. The wording capped him. Dijon's halvage applied to specified quantities, and largely to foreign and traveling merchants rather than local sellers, which tells you the levy started life as a protectionist tax and got handed to him as compensation. He could not take whatever he liked. The claim was as big as the sentence describing it and not one egg bigger. That office was geographically stuck. It covered one town, one jurisdiction. Your rights stopped at a boundary you could walk to. He also had to be visible. In 15th century Arras, the executioner wore a cloak in the city's colors with a gallows on the front and a ladder on the back. Dijon required a white staff and an orange badge showing a gallows and a rope. In 1551, Dijon put a fine of 3 livres 5 sols on failing to carry the staff, and later rules threatened to throw him out of the city entirely for refusing the clothing, which tells you something the ordinance never says out loud. They kept fining him for not wearing the mark, so he kept not wearing it. Every one of those rules lives in exactly the same place his income lives. By now, this looks like a license to print bread and eggs. So here's what breaks it, and it breaks fast. You have no customers. Nobody chooses you, which means nobody can be kept. You have no product, so there is nothing to carry to the next town. You have no saleable business assets because the bed and the sword and the gloves belong to the council. What you have is a permission. Reliably, you are the least popular man in the room on the day the council sits down to review permissions. Look at Arras. Between 1400 and 1600, the town went through roughly 45 executioners. Average tenure under 5 years. Some were pushed out, some ended up on the scaffold themselves. That is not a stable family dynasty printing money for 2 centuries. That's a turnover rate you'd expect from a failing shop. The dynasties people talk about, the Guillaumes and the de Maurice and the Sansons, are real. But in Arras, that pattern only really begins in 1631, when a father and son held the post between them for 38 years, and long tenures became normal afterwards. For the 200 years before that, the average man in the job lasted less time than a modern car loan. Now the specific way it ends. The clearest documented case is late, and I want to be straight about that, because it's from 1784 rather than the 1400s. The executioner of Angers went bankrupt after the local authorities abruptly revoked his right of halvage. No scandal, no crime, no failure of skill. The council removed one line, and the business underneath it collapsed. That is the whole risk in one sentence. Not a bad harvest, not plague, a committee. Local councils weren't the only danger. Friedland's argument is that the executioner's fortunes rose and fell with the institution of spectacular public punishment itself, which means the trade was exposed to something no owner can hedge, a change in taste. When France stripped away halvage in the later 18th century, the average executioner's income fell from around 2,500 livres a year to about 1,500. The proportion earning over 2,000 dropped from about 40% to 21%. Those are late figures for a medieval story, but they're the only place we can actually watch the mechanism fail with numbers attached. And what they show is a whole profession losing about 40% of its income because a levy was abolished. Riga's office survived until 1863 and then simply ceased to exist once corporal punishment disappeared from the Russian Empire. Here's the cruel part, the one that makes this different from every other business we've built. When a miller loses the mill, he can go and do something else. When you lose this, the same stigma that was collecting your eggs for you last month is now the reason no guild will admit you, no household will hire you, and no family will take your children. You are not merely out of business, you are unemployable, in a town where your name is the reason. Run it both ways. In a good year, you are in a large town with a busy court and a market that fills 3 streets. Corporal sentences come through steadily, and each one carries a fee. The salary arrives whether they do or not. The sewer contract supports a crew you're paid to run. Hides come in off the streets for free and go out as leather money. And every market day you walk the rows and the bag fills without a coin leaving your hand. There's something else in that good year that's easy to miss. Because you are paid partly in food rather than entirely in wages, rising grain prices don't do to you what they do to everyone else. When grain prices spike, a laborer's day rate buys less bread. Your entitlement is a loaf, and a loaf is still a loaf. That isn't a claim any single document makes, it's what follows from the way the payment was written, but it means the executioner's household is partly insulated from price inflation in exactly the years that squeeze everyone around it. In a bad year, you're in a sparse rural jurisdiction where the court produces 4 executions in a decade. Your havage rights are narrow or absent. You have no crew, no relatives to draw aids from, and no succession claim. You are on standby forever for almost nothing. Or you're in the good town and the council rewrites one clause, and one of the streams holding the whole business up disappears in the same week. Which is really the difference between the men who did well and the men who didn't, and it has almost nothing to do with the acts. The ones who prospered served large urban markets and held broad ancillary rights rather than just execution fees. They belonged to an established family with a claim on the succession, had assistants and the capacity to run the sanitation side as a real operation, and stayed on good terms with the council. In 18th century Rouen, the Ferry brothers got their basic salary doubled to 6,000 livres because they were in a big city and they knew how to negotiate. The ones who failed served thin territories, worked alone, had only the scaffold to bill for, and fought the authorities over their own rules. Which brings us back to the market in Dijon and the question I left there. Why would a town bother to legislate the correct way to put an egg in a man's bag? Untouchability wasn't decoration, and it wasn't only cruelty. It was load-bearing. A man everyone avoids can be sent to collect from people who have no interest in paying. He can be sent into the cesspit, and to the leper, and to the carcass in the gutter, and to the outsider in the market, and nobody will argue that the job should have gone to somebody more respectable. His pollution is what makes the whole franchise enforceable. It is also, exactly, what stops him ever leaving it. Could you have got rich holding this office? Honestly, no, not rich. Comfortable, sometimes very comfortable, in the right town with the right rights in a good stretch of years. The hard numbers we have put a successful holder somewhere around a middling gentleman, and those numbers come centuries later than the market we opened on. Anyone who tells you a medieval executioner out-earned a knight or a priest is quoting a figure that doesn't have a document under it. What you could get was security in a world with none, paid in food, cushioned against some price shocks, and completely at the mercy of a council that could end it with a sentence. One thing I'm still not settled on, and I'd like to know where you land. Do you think the towns made him untouchable first, and then had to invent all those strange privileges to compensate a man nobody would go near? Or did they make him untouchable on purpose, because an untouchable man is the only one who can collect from people who don't want to pay? I changed my mind twice while I was reading for this, and I'm still only about 60% sure. Not bad for a man they wouldn't let touch an egg.